Hello and welcome to the Mindset User to User podcast. First, let me apologize for the absence over the past few weeks. If you have noticed, there were no new episodes over the past, 2-3 weeks. This is unfortunately due to a business I needed to take care of. And this thing that happened to me, together with work, really swallowed me. So I had no time to edit and prepare new episodes. However, the good news is that from now on, we're not forecasting or foreseeing at least any major events, so everything should now run smoothly again. So once again, I apologize. In the same time, I hope that you used these 3 weeks of break from the podcast to keep going on with your meditation, keep going on with that passive approach I was mentioning in the last episode number 5, where I was talking about the comfort zone. Do you remember when I was saying take a passive approach into noticing the thin boundaries of your comfort zone? And this is super important for today's topic, which is exposure. So let's have a quick thought about episode number 3, where I was talking about stress management. I was talking about meditation, and I was referring to meditation as the active approach when it comes to stress management. And on the other hand, I've mentioned exposure as a passive approach that allows you to manage stress. Episode number 5, so last episode, is very connected with today's topic. So if you have forgotten what we talked about last time, please stop listening now, go back to episode number 5, and then come back to this episode number 6. Because a lot of concepts that have been introduced in the last episode are coming back in today's episode. So it's very important that you have a full and complete understanding of the comfort zone and the stretch zone, especially the stretch zone. So why was that passive approach do you remember I was saying just be a passive witness about the thin band and just notice the thin boundaries or the thin boundary between your comfort zone and the stretch zone. Try to understand in a passive way where your comfort zone stops and your stretch zone begins. Because that is exactly how exposure works. Exposure takes place in the stretch zone. This is why having that passive approach in just noticing throughout your day, throughout your routine, as you go along over the past few weeks, where you stop feeling comfortable and you start to feel a bit awkward, a bit upset about certain dynamics or situations. Now, before explaining how exposure works and what do you need to do so that exposure will be effective in your stress management, I would like to introduce to you a name or a figure. This chap is David Goggins. Now, if you have no idea who this chap is, I will explain to you. If I'm not mistaken, he's a former Navy SEALs and is currently known as the toughest man alive. If you go on the Instagram, there are plenty of videos of him. Even us, we shared a small reel with this guy explaining a very important concept, which we will cover in another episode. But why is this name so important? Because he's the master of exposure, in my opinion. He's always leaving his comfort zone to face new challenges. He has a very extreme approach. We don't need to become like David Goggins, but I think it's very motivational to have a look at his approach, the way he deals with his comfort zone. So if you have some time throughout your day, have a quick read about him, have a look, because you will find him very, very inspirational and and extremely motivational as well. But how does exposure work? Well, this term, as you probably noticed and as I've said before, is very self-explanatory. The concept is we expose ourselves to the stressors so that we get used to it and our comfort zone expands. This is the focus. Our comfort zone expands because we're getting used to the stressor we are facing. So think about the comfort, stretch, and panic model as circles. You have a small circle, which is the center of your person, and that is your comfort zone. This circle is within another circle, which is slightly bigger, has a slightly bigger radius, and that is the stretch zone. And then you have a bigger one, which is the panic area. So, if you expanded the smallest circle, okay, which is your comfort zone, you're pushing all the other circles to expand. You're pushing them because the areas are always the same. So the smaller circle is your comfort zone. If you expand it, then you are expanding your stretch zone, which is then expanding your panic, which is then expanding your panic area, your panic zone. What I'm actually saying is that you are expanding your comfort zone, which means you are able to take the borders farther away from you, which means you are comfortable in much more stressful situations. And even the stretch zone, which is the area where we want to work when it comes to exposure, is expanding as well, which is pushing away the panic area or the panic zone. So what I mean is, by expanding the comfort zone, you're pushing the border or these borders of the other areas, stretch and panic, farther away from you. Hence, you will be able to withstand a new and higher level of stress. Let me give you some practical examples. When you're entering a cold swimming pool, at first it's shocking, it's very uncomfortable, it's cold, but as time passes, you get used to it. You move, you start swimming, you warm up, and when being consistent with diving in cold water, your body gets stronger, and as time goes by, you're able to resist colder and colder water. If you want another practical example, think about running. You go running, you run for a mile, and the first time you do it, you're tired after a mile. You're out of breath, your legs are shaking. But if you are consistent, again, consistency is the base of everything when it comes to mindset. You can run a mile today, you run a mile tomorrow, you run a mile the next day. After a certain period of time, you will be able to run 2 miles, and then 3 miles, and then 4 miles, and so on. Exposure works in the same way. You expose yourself to a dynamic that makes you feel a bit upset, so you deliberately enter your stretch zone, and after a while, your comfort zone expands a bit. You will reach the point where exposing to that certain situation or dynamic will no longer cause you to stress. That is the moment you have expanded your comfort zone. A certain activity that made you feel upset, made you feel a bit awkward, now makes you feel at ease. So you feel again within your comfort zone. Now, before we go any further with today's episode, I would like to make a statement. I like to talk about meditation, the active process, and exposure, the passive process. Why do I want to make this clear? Because I was discussing this with other people that are very good mindset coach, mindset mentor, and they made me notice that exposure has a small active bit, which is you have to actively expose yourself to a certain stressor. This is true. However, the way you manage stress is, in my opinion, and for the purpose of this podcast, is passive. Because with meditation, you will find you need an active phase, which is finding the time. You have to be consistent. You have to find your place, meditate, and think about emptying your mind, the breath. And that's why I think that is an active process. You are taking active steps towards stress management. With exposure, it's completely different. Once you exposed yourself, you just witness what happens. You keep on doing, you keep on exposing yourself to a certain dynamic until you feel comfortable with it. And that involves no active process, in my own opinion. Again, it's an opinion. It's my personal way of viewing exposure as a process towards stress management. Now, whilst at first glance exposure might seem an incredibly easy process, it's just passive. You just have to expose yourself a bit, and then you wait. So some of us might be tricked into thinking it's an harmless process. This is not true. Exposure, if wrongly managed, can damage us and create a regression. Meditation, in my opinion, doesn't have any contradictions. Exposure does. It is essential that you expose yourself gradually to the stressors. And most importantly, you allow time to be spent again in the comfort zone to recover. To give you a better idea, it's like working out. If you just train without having rest days, you will just exhaust yourself, and it's pointless. Because you will just tire yourself, you arrive to the point where the performance will start decreasing because you are tired, because you're not allowing yourself to rest. What is important to remember is if we expose ourselves too much, we might exhaust ourselves. Exhaust means that your rest will take much longer than what it would normally take, and ultimately, when it comes to exposure, if we get exhausted, this might install in our mind, of course, the fear of the stressor we were exposed to. This is a very negative event. Why? Because the human mind is designed for survival. A potentially traumatizing experience is very likely to influence the way we perceive a dynamic to the point where just by thinking of that dynamic, that situation, we will skip the strike zone and automatically enter the panic room. Please note that there is a very similar process which is known, it's not a process, it's a condition known as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a very similar process to what I have just described, talking about getting exhausted. Don't get scared of exposure, and remember that it's the dose that makes the poison. This means that over time, if you expose yourself gradually, if you don't push it too far, exposure will be extremely beneficial to you. You just need to know how much to expose yourself. And the only way to learn how to do so is to expose yourself. I can grant you that when you will try over the next week to expose yourself to certain stressors, sometimes you will expose yourself a bit too much. When that happens, don't worry, it's normal, because you need to understand how much exposure you need. It takes a bit of time. You will notice it, okay? It takes just a bit of time. From now on, as I said, the exercise is just to gradually enter the strike zone. Think of a situation that makes you uncomfortable and just embrace it. It can be a very obvious one, public speeches. Some of us are very scared of talking to public, so to a bunch of people. If that is something that stresses you, think of situations at work or in school where you can talk to your class, to your colleagues, and have a bit of public speaking. But please try to find the activities. As I said in the last episode, notice throughout your day what stresses you. Try to find the very thin boundaries of your comfort zone and try to cross them. This is the message I want to pass on to you. This is your exercise. And of course, as I said, take small steps. If before I wanted you to have this very, very extremely passive approach where you're just noticing it now I want you to expose yourself to these dynamics, situations where you feel a bit stressed. Take small steps. So this is the end of episode number 6, where we discussed exposure. There are a couple of very interesting episodes coming up in the next few weeks. Of course, I remind you, we have an Instagram page. If you want to interact with us, that is the right place. We will try to go through every single message we get. We will try to reply to every single one of you. If you want to discuss about any episode, any topic, we are there to listen and to interact with you. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again next week with a new episode of the Mindset User to User podcast.